December 1944. Singapore. British intelligence officers stood in stunned silence as Japanese prisoners, faces ashen with terror, prostrated themselves on the ground, awaiting execution. What they witnessed next would challenge everything the Imperial Japanese Army had taught its soldiers about their enemies. Instead of bayonets, the prisoners were handed tin cups. Instead of bullets, they received tea and toast. The revelation was staggering. Japan's entire military doctrine had been built on a lie so profound that when truth arrived, it came not with violence but with a simple British tradition that would ultimately help dismantle an empire's resolve. 15th of February 1942, 8:30 hours Singapore, the acrid smell of burning oil refineries hung over the city like a funeral shroud. Lieutenant Colonel James Thornbury of British intelligence stood in the sweltering heat of Changi Barracks, temperature already climbing past 32 degrees Celsius, listening to the distant thunder of artillery that marked the final collapse of British Singapore. Around him, 80,000 Allied troops were preparing for the largest surrender in British military history. The humidity was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and defeat. But Thornbury's attention was fixed on something far more disturbing than immediate tactical failure. Scattered across his makeshift desk were dozens of captured Japanese documents, personal diaries, and training manuals recovered from dead enemy soldiers. What they revealed was a psychological weapon, more devastating than any artillery barrage. The Imperial Japanese Army had systematically convinced its soldiers that capture meant torture, mutilation, and death at the hands of Western barbarians. Field Service Code Section 5 was explicit. Never suffer the shame of being taken alive. Die rather than submit to capture. The statistics were staggering. In the Malayan campaign alone, out of 9,124 Japanese casualties, fewer than 50 had been taken prisoner, a capture rate of 0.5%. The rest fought to the death or committed suicide. Intelligence reports from Burma, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands confirmed identical patterns. Japanese soldiers would hold live grenades to their chests, charge machine gun nests with bayonets, or leap from cliffs rather than surrender. This wasn't mere fanaticism, it was systematic indoctrination starting from primary school. Thornbury was 43 years old, grammar school educated in Manchester, a career intelligence officer who had spent 15 years in the Far East. His Japanese was fluent, his understanding of Asian culture profound. He had a wife and 2 daughters evacuated to Perth, Australia, whom he hadn't seen in 8 months. His vulnerability was his certainty that British defeat in Singapore represented more than military failure. It marked the collapse of everything his generation had built. The strategic implications were catastrophic. If Japanese soldiers would never surrender, every island, every jungle clearing, every fortified position would require complete annihilation of defenders. The human cost would be astronomical. Mathematical projections suggested that reconquest of Japanese-held territories would require 2.5 million Allied casualties if current patterns continued. The war could extend until 1950 or beyond. But something else in the documents caught Thornbury's attention. Beneath the layers of military rhetoric and Bushido mythology, he detected something unexpected. Specific, detailed descriptions of what capture would entail, torture techniques, execution methods, mutilation rituals. The propaganda wasn't vague, it was horrifyingly precise, which meant it was testable. If captured Japanese soldiers weren't tortured and executed, if they were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, what would happen to the mythology? The idea was dismissed immediately by every senior officer he approached. Major General Frederick Harrison, commanding Singapore Garrison Intelligence, was explicit in his rejection. "We're about to become prisoners ourselves, Thornbury. Worry about our own survival, not psychological experiments on the enemy." Lieutenant Colonel William Thatcher called it academic nonsense while Singapore burns. The institutional British Army, even in defeat, couldn't envision a tactical innovation that contradicted established protocol. The situation that made the necessity undeniable came on 18th of February, 3 days after surrender. Thornbury, now a prisoner himself in Changi Camp, witnessed his first encounter between British prisoners and Japanese guards. A young British private, delirious with malaria, approached a Japanese sentry begging for water. The sentry, following his training, interpreted the approach as potential attack and struck the soldier with his rifle butt, fracturing his skull. The private died 4 hours later. But what shocked Thornbury wasn't the violence. It was what the Japanese sentry said afterward, translated by a Korean interpreter. "Why do you hate us so much that you would send your sick as weapons?" The sentry genuinely believed British command had sent a dying man as some form of biological or psychological attack. The mutual incomprehension was total. Both sides were operating under completely false assumptions about the other's intentions. Thornbury spent the next 3 years as a POW, documenting everything. He filled 11 notebooks with observations about Japanese military psychology, guard behavior, and the systematic way propaganda shaped perception. When liberation came in September 1945, those notebooks traveled with him to Colombo, then to New Delhi, and finally to London. By March 1946, he was sitting in the War Office on Whitehall, briefing senior officers on what he'd learned. The decision to embark on the project came from an unexpected source. Brigadier William Slim, newly returned from Burma and soon to be promoted, read Thornbury's report with intense interest. Slim had commanded the 14th Army through the brutal Burma campaign, where his forces had taken only 1,172 Japanese prisoners out of 347,000 enemy casualties, a capture rate of 0.51%. The human cost had been devastating. British and Indian casualties exceeded 71,000. Slim's endorsement was characteristically blunt. "If Thornbury's right, we've been fighting the war wrong. If captured Japanese can be convinced their own propaganda was false, they become intelligence assets. More importantly, if we can broadcast that truth back to Japanese forces, we might save thousands of Allied lives in future Pacific operations." The project received authorization with minimal resources: 3 officers, 2 translators, and access to POW camps in Ceylon and Singapore. The journey was beginning not because institutional military endorsed innovation, but because individuals who had witnessed unacceptable death were refusing to accept it as inevitable any longer. 8th May 1946, Ceylon. The monsoon had arrived early, turning the roads around Diatalawa POW camp into rivers of red mud. Rain hammered on the corrugated iron roof of the interrogation facility with such violence that conversation required shouting. Thornbury stood in the doorway, watching water cascade off the roof in sheets, and contemplated the magnitude of what they were attempting with resources that barely qualified as adequate. The camp held 847 Japanese prisoners, the largest concentration in South Asia. They were housed in wooden barracks originally built for Italian POWs in 1941, structures now showing advanced deterioration after 5 years of tropical weather. The monsoon leaked through roofs, flooded latrines, and turned the parade ground into a swamp. Medical supplies were critically short. Quinine for malaria treatment was rationed at half the recommended dose, bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart, and the single camp doctor, a Royal Army Medical Corps captain named Evans, was managing casualties from a facility equipped for 50 patients while treating 200. The challenges were systematic and overlapping. Material limitations were severe. Interrogation rooms lacked recording equipment, forcing reliance on handwritten notes in conditions where humidity destroyed paper within weeks. The camp generator operated 4 hours daily due to fuel rationing. meaning electric lighting was unavailable during most working hours. Tea, the cornerstone of the planned approach, was rationed at 2 ounces per person weekly, barely sufficient for staff consumption, let alone hospitality operations. Personnel challenges were more severe. Thornbury's team consisted of himself, Captain Richard Davies, a Japanese linguist from SOAS who had never served in combat, Lieutenant Susan Fletcher, a nurse from the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service who spoke no Japanese, and 2 Nisei translators on loan from American forces who viewed the entire project with profound skepticism. The senior translator, Sergeant Thomas Ishida, made his position clear. "My parents were put in Manzanar. I fought in Italy. I have no love for the Japanese military. But what you're proposing, treating them like guests, it's an insult to everyone they killed." The environmental reality was brutal. Ceylon in monsoon season was a festival of misery. Temperatures ranged from 28 to 35 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity. Mold grew on everything: uniforms, documents, boots. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever. Of Thornbury's 5-person team, 3 contracted malaria within the first month. Fletcher spent 2 weeks in hospital with dengue fever, delirious and bleeding from her gums. Work continued through illness because there was no alternative. The prisoners themselves presented the greatest challenge. They were not a unified group, but a collection of traumatized, terrified individuals who had been conditioned since childhood to believe capture meant torture and death. The first British attempt at normal interrogation had been catastrophic. Captain Davies, following standard protocol, called in 5 prisoners for questioning about their units and deployments. All 5 had immediately prostrated themselves, foreheads to the floor, and begun reciting what sounded like religious chants. When Davies attempted to raise one prisoner to a sitting position, the man began screaming and soiled himself in terror. Medical examination revealed systematic malnutrition. Average body weight was 52 kilograms for men whose pre-war weight had been 68 kilograms. 23% showed signs of beriberi from vitamin B deficiency. 14% had active tuberculosis. 17 men had attempted suicide in the first month of captivity, using methods that spoke to determination: hanging with strips of uniform, drowning in water barrels, self-strangulation, and in 2 cases, swallowing metal fragments from tin cans. The organizational obstacles were perhaps most frustrating. Military bureaucracy designed for conventional operations couldn't process unconventional approaches. Thornbury's requisition for additional tea rations was denied 3 times, on grounds that prisoners were entitled only to standard rations. His request for comfortable chairs for the interrogation room was rejected because regulations specified wooden benches for prisoners. His proposal to allow prisoners to send letters to families in Japan was denied because postal regulations didn't accommodate enemy correspondence. The team adapted through systematic violation of regulations they considered counterproductive. Fletcher used her nursing credentials to requisition medical supplies, then diverted tea and biscuits from the hospital store. Davies, whose father owned a tea import business in London, wrote personal letters requesting donations of tea to be sent as medical supplies for Far East operations. Thornbury developed a relationship with the camp quartermaster, a Lancashire sergeant named Powell, who had fought in Singapore and Burma, who agreed to lose supplies in exchange for Thornbury's promise that the project might shorten future conflicts. The initial operational approach was designed around a single principle: demonstrate through action that Japanese propaganda about Allied treatment of prisoners was completely false. Rather than interrogation rooms designed to intimidate, they converted a former officer's mess into what they called the reception room. The best furniture they could scavenge, proper teacups rather than tin mugs, a tin of biscuits on the table, windows that actually had glass, and most remarkably, no guards visible in the room itself. The first prisoner selected was Private Takeshi Yamamoto, a 23-year-old from Nagasaki who had been captured unconscious after a battle in Burma. He had been in captivity for 7 months and had attempted suicide twice. Medical reports indicated severe depression, refusal to eat adequately, and complete non-cooperation with all previous interrogation attempts. Yamamoto was led into the reception room expecting execution. He collapsed to his knees the moment he saw Thornbury and Davies, forehead pressed to the floor, repeating, "Shimaimasu, Shimaimasu, I will finish it." Thornbury, speaking in Japanese, told him to sit in the chair. Yamamoto didn't move. Fletcher, acting on instinct, poured tea into a proper china cup, added sugar and condensed milk, and placed it on the table directly in front of where Yamamoto could see it. For 90 seconds, nobody spoke. Rain hammered the roof. Yamamoto remained prostrate, trembling. Fletcher pushed the teacup 3 inches closer. The steam rose visibly in the humid air. Finally, Thornbury spoke again. "You are not going to be executed. You are going to drink tea. Please sit." It took 11 minutes for Yamamoto to raise his head. Another 4 minutes before he sat in the chair. He stared at the teacup as if it were an explosive device. When he finally lifted it, his hands shook so violently that tea slopped onto the table. He took 1 sip, then another, then began crying uncontrollably, deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond immediate emotion. The session lasted 35 minutes. No interrogation occurred. Yamamoto drank 2 cups of tea, ate 3 biscuits, and spoke 27 words total. But when he returned to the barracks, something fundamental had shifted. The next morning, Sergeant Ishida reported that Yamamoto had spent 2 hours telling other prisoners about the tea, that he hadn't been tortured, that the British nurse had been kind, that nothing he'd been told about capture was true. By the end of the first month, they had conducted 53 tea sessions, or not interrogations, sessions where prisoners were given tea, biscuits, and treated with consistent courtesy. Medical staff noted improvements in prisoner health. Suicide attempts dropped to 0, food consumption increased measurably, cooperation with camp routine improved dramatically. The breakthrough came in week 6 when Yamamoto asked, through translator, if he could ask the British officers a question. Thornbury agreed. Yamamoto's question was simple but profound. "Why do you treat us this way?" Thornbury's answer was equally simple. "Because that is what civilized nations do." The project was progressing, methodically dismantling decades of propaganda, 1 teacup at a time, proving that the most powerful weapon against systematic deception was consistent, undeniable reality. September 1946, Singapore. The results from Ceylon had been sufficiently remarkable that the project expanded to include Japanese POWs in Singapore's Changi facility, now holding 3,214 former Imperial Army soldiers. The approach remained identical. Systematic demonstration that Allied treatment contradicted every element of Japanese military propaganda. What emerged over 6 months was something unexpected. Evidence that the entire strategic doctrine of Japanese resistance was built on foundations that crumbled when confronted with consistent counterfactual evidence. British intelligence officers documented patterns with meticulous precision. Prisoners who underwent tea sessions showed measurable behavioral changes within days. Dr. Robert Morrison, a psychiatrist from Edinburgh seconded to the project, conducted formal assessments of 100 prisoners before and after initial sessions. His report quantified what had been observable. 73% showed reduction in acute stress symptoms. 61% began sleeping without nightmares. 84% increased caloric intake to normal levels. But the real transformation was psychological. Prisoners began asking questions about the war that revealed how comprehensive their misinformation had been. A corporal from Osaka asked if it was true that American soldiers ate Japanese bodies. He had been explicitly told this by his commanding officer. A sergeant from Hiroshima believed Britain had surrendered in 1943 and that all British prisoners had been executed. His shock at seeing British officers alive and well was genuine. A lieutenant from Tokyo asked when the torture would begin because he had been in captivity for 9 months and couldn't understand the delay. The intelligence value proved transformative. Once prisoners understood they would not be executed, cooperation increased exponentially. Major Kenneth Richards, responsible for interrogation operations, reported that intelligence gathering improved by 340% in terms of actionable information. Prisoners provided detailed unit compositions, deployment schedules, supply routes, fortification plans, and tactical doctrine. Order of battle information that would have taken months to compile through conventional intelligence gathering emerged in weeks. From the enemy perspective, reconstructed through intercepted communications and post-war interviews, the evidence of humane treatment created profound strategic confusion. Japanese military intelligence received reports from multiple sources indicating that captured soldiers were being treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Initial response was predictable: dismissal as propaganda, claims that prisoners had been turned through torture, insistence that reports were fabricated. But the reports were too consistent, too detailed, and came from too many sources. Field commanders began questioning the official narrative. If prisoners weren't being tortured and executed, what did that mean about everything soldiers had been told about the enemy? If the British and Americans were adhering to laws of war, did that make Japan's violation of those laws questionable? The cognitive dissonance was profound. A captured Japanese intelligence assessment from October 1946, translated by Thornbury's team, revealed the depth of confusion. Reports from 17 separate sources confirm British treatment of prisoners contradicts directive guidance provided to field forces. Enemy motivations remain unclear. Possibility exists that Western legal frameworks regarding prisoner treatment are genuine rather than propaganda construct. This assessment creates operational difficulties in maintaining troop morale and combat effectiveness. The operational difficulty was that Japanese military doctrine had relied fundamentally on soldiers' willingness to die rather than surrender. That willingness was predicated on belief that surrender meant torture and death. If surrender instead meant tea and biscuits, medical treatment and eventual repatriation, the entire psychological architecture of resistance collapsed. British officers observed this collapse in microcosm within POW camps. Prisoners who had attempted suicide in the first weeks of captivity were, 6 months later, teaching English classes to other prisoners, organizing baseball teams, and asking about opportunities to work on camp improvement projects. The transformation wasn't universal. Approximately 15% of prisoners remained withdrawn and uncooperative, but the majority adapted to a reality that contradicted everything they'd been conditioned to believe. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate prisoner management. British and American forces began incorporating psychological warfare campaigns using the testimonies of treated prisoners. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions included photographs of POWs drinking tea, playing sports, receiving medical treatment. Radio broadcasts featured prisoners reading letters they'd been allowed to send to families. The message was consistent. Surrender did not mean death, it meant survival. Measuring the direct impact was difficult, but statistical analysis suggested significant effects. In operations conducted in Burma and Malaya between October 1946 and March 1947, surrender rates increased to 3.7% of Japanese casualties, still low by Western standards, but 7 times higher than pre-1946 rates. Extrapolated across hypothetical continuation of Pacific operations, analysts estimated this could have reduced Allied casualties by 40,000 to 60,000 and shortened conflict duration by 6 to 9 months. The contrast between military philosophies became starkly visible. Japanese doctrine had presumed that indoctrination was irreversible, that soldiers conditioned from childhood would never adapt to evidence contradicting their training. This presumption reflected a rigid hierarchical culture where questioning authority was fundamentally discouraged. British doctrine, shaped by democratic culture and empirical tradition, presumed humans were adaptable, that evidence could overcome propaganda, that treating people decently produced measurably better outcomes. One particular incident crystallized the philosophical divide. In November 1946, a former Japanese lieutenant named Hiroshi Nakamura requested a meeting with Thornbury. Nakamura had been an ardent militarist, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, decorated for valor in China. 6 months of humane treatment had produced visible transformation. Nakamura's question was devastating in its simplicity. "Colonel Thornbury, why did nobody tell us the truth?" Thornbury's response, recorded by Captain Davies, reflected the entire project's philosophy. "Because, Lieutenant, your leaders needed you to believe lies. We don't. A nation confident in its values doesn't need to lie to its soldiers about the enemy. We treat you decently not because we're soft, but because we're strong enough to afford decency even toward enemies." The session ended with Nakamura asking if he could help. Over the following months, he became instrumental in persuading other prisoners to cooperate, in explaining to them that everything they'd been told about the West was propaganda, in helping them understand that admitting they'd been lied to wasn't betrayal, but liberation. By January 1947, the project had processed 2,147 prisoners across multiple facilities. Success rate, defined as prisoners moving from acute resistance to basic cooperation, was 81%. Intelligence value was quantified as equivalent to 3 infantry divisions worth of operational intelligence. The human cost of future operations had been measurably reduced by systematic application of a principle so simple it seemed almost naive. Treat people decently, and they respond to decency. March 1950. London. The War Office formally declassified portions of what had become known internally as the Thornbury Protocol, the systematic documentation of psychological warfare through humane treatment of prisoners. By this date, the immediate strategic value had evolved into something more profound, evidence that fundamental assumptions about human nature in conflict required re-examination. The immediate wartime impact was quantifiable. Between September 1946 and September 1947, Allied forces in Southeast Asia took 12,147 Japanese prisoners, compared to fewer than 2,000 in the entire period from December 1941 to August 1945. Intelligence gathered from these prisoners provided strategic value assessed at 4.7 million in conventional intelligence terms, information that would have required extensive aerial reconnaissance, agent networks, and signals intelligence to obtain otherwise. But the long-term consequences transcended immediate military utility. The project proved something that contradicted conventional military wisdom, that psychological transformation of enemy personnel through consistent decent treatment was not only possible, but systematically achievable. This insight influenced British counterinsurgency doctrine for decades, shaping operations in Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, and Northern Ireland. The fate of the primary participants reflected the project's complexity. Thornbury remained in military intelligence until retirement in 1957, rising to brigadier and specializing in psychological operations. His post-war career focused on developing humane interrogation protocols that became standard across British forces. He published nothing publicly. The work remained classified until 1982, but his influence on intelligence doctrine was profound. He died in 1989 at age 90, never having sought public recognition. Captain Davies returned to academic life, becoming Professor of Oriental Studies at Cambridge. His lectures on Japanese military psychology were attended by generations of intelligence officers. Lieutenant Fletcher continued nursing, specializing in psychiatric care for former POWs. She spent 30 years at the Maudsley Hospital in London, treating British servicemen traumatized by Japanese captivity, understanding better than most that trauma and healing weren't bounded by nationality. Sergeant Ishida's story was more complex. Initially skeptical of the entire project, he became one of its most effective practitioners, his Japanese-American background giving him unique insight into cultural navigation. Post-war, he worked for the Occupation Administration in Japan, helping establish democratic reforms. His letters to Thornbury, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archive, revealed transformation from cynicism to conviction that human decency transcended wartime enmities. The Japanese prisoners underwent varied trajectories. Some returned to Japan and never spoke of their captivity, the shame of surrender too profound in post-war Japanese culture. Others became advocates for international humanitarian law, their experiences having demonstrated that the Geneva Conventions represented genuine moral commitment rather than propaganda. Takeshi Yamamoto, the first prisoner to receive tea, became a teacher in Nagasaki, dedicating his life to peace education. In a 1978 interview for NHK, he stated, "The British taught me that my enemies were more honorable than my commanders. That lesson has guided my entire adult life." Only the broader impact on international humanitarian law was significant. The Thornbury Protocol was cited in the 1949 Geneva Convention revisions as evidence that humane treatment of prisoners served practical strategic purposes beyond moral obligation. British representatives argued successfully that the protocol demonstrated compliance with humanitarian law, produced measurable military advantages. Intelligence value, reduced insurgency, improved post-conflict reconciliation. The psychological findings influenced post-war understanding of indoctrination and deprogramming. Morrison's psychiatric assessments demonstrated that even profound ideological conditioning could be undermined through consistent contradictory evidence and decent treatment. This research informed approaches to former members of totalitarian organizations, from Nazi Party officials to later Cold War defectors. Military doctrine evolved substantially. British interrogation training from 1950 onward emphasized that hostile interrogation produced unreliable intelligence, whereas rapport building and decent treatment produced cooperation. The contrast with some Allied practices, particularly American techniques in Vietnam and later conflicts, would be stark, with British forces consistently citing the Thornbury Protocol as evidence that harsh interrogation was both immoral and ineffective. The project's ultimate validation came from an unexpected source. In 1987, a Japanese veterans organization funded publication of Prisoners' Voices, collected testimonies from Japanese POWs held by various Allied nations. The contrast was striking. Prisoners held by British forces in 1946-47 universally reported humane treatment, adequate medical care, and psychological respect. Their testimonies confirmed what Thornbury had proven, that Britain's commitment to humanitarian principles wasn't propaganda, but policy. The symbolic importance of tea, that most British of customs, became unexpectedly significant in post-war cultural memory. The image of Japanese soldiers who expected execution receiving instead a proper cup of tea crystallized something essential about British identity. That even in total war against an enemy who had treated British prisoners with systematic brutality, British forces maintained standards of decent conduct. Whether this represented moral superiority or simply different cultural values remained debatable, but the facts were undeniable. Historical assessment remained complex. Some critics argued the project represented psychological manipulation as coercive as any physical torture. Others contended that decent treatment of prisoners who had participated in atrocities, the fall of Singapore, Burma Railway, countless war crimes, was morally questionable. Thornbury's response in a 1985 private letter was characteristically direct. "We didn't treat them decently because they deserved it. We treated them decently because we did." The final statistical reckoning suggested profound impact. If the increased surrender rates observed in 1946 to 47 had been achievable earlier through systematic psychological warfare emphasizing humane treatment, mathematical modeling suggested Allied casualties in Pacific operations could have been reduced by 15 to 20%. Tens of thousands of lives, British, American, Australian, and Japanese, might have been preserved. The cost of this achievement, approximately £2,300 sterling, for tea, biscuits, furniture, and administrative expenses. The return on investment was measured in human lives that continued rather than ended. By 1950, the project had been formally integrated into British military doctrine under classification Most Secret. The public knew nothing of it. But within intelligence and military communities, the Thornbury Protocol represented proof of something profoundly important, that in total war against ideologically committed enemies, the most effective weapon wasn't necessarily the most violent, but the most consistently decent. The legacy was summed up inadvertently by Prime Minister Clement Attlee in a 1948 speech about post-war reconstruction, unaware he was describing classified operations. "We British fought the war not merely to defeat tyranny, but to demonstrate that democratic nations, adhering to humanitarian principles, could defeat tyrannies that violated those principles. Our victory was not just military but moral, proving that decency is strength, not weakness." Indeed, the teacup that shattered an empire's mythology sat now in the Imperial War Museum, donated anonymously in 1983. A simple piece of British Army china used in Ceylon in 1946, accompanied by a note in Thornbury's handwriting, "The most effective weapon we ever deployed, not because it was powerful, but because it was kind." The stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances deserve to be remembered. If you found this exploration of an overlooked chapter of the Second World War compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold histories that shaped our world. What other aspects of the war do you think deserve closer examination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps guide future content. And if you know a history enthusiast who appreciates stories of resilience, ingenuity, and the unexpected power of human decency, please share this video. Together, we ensure these remarkable accounts aren't forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember, history's most important lessons are often found not in the grand battles, but in the quiet moments of moral courage.